The morning sky over the Liffey looked like brushed steel. I reached the lobby before most people and stood for a while in the hush of glass and polished stone. The screens were already awake, rolling through the same triumphant slides in a perfect loop. Partnership of the decade. Synergy in motion. A promise that today would change everything at Tessellate FinTech. The words moved like a current under the floor. I watched the logo spin in the corner of the main display and counted its turns, an old habit that kept my nerves honest. 17 revolutions in a minute. I remembered nights when I counted log lines instead of sleep. Naya stepped onto the little platform with a microphone and a coat the exact color of a sunrise. She called us a family. She thanked us for grit and resilience. She said our work would finally be seen by the right people across the river at Orbitis Group. I stayed near the back with my coffee cupped in both hands. The heat made a small circle of fog on the glass barrier in front of me, then vanished, then returned. That rhythm made more sense than the language in the room. The announcement about bonuses came wrapped in phrases that sounded like cushions. Deferred, aligned with the next quarter, reflective of a pivot. A few claps started, and then thinned when it was clear most of us were not sure whether to smile. A second announcement followed. Reporting lines would be refreshed to empower growth. I would be working under a new manager. The name arrived with the smoothness of an elevator. Leohart. I finished the last sip of coffee and placed the cup on a table. The cup left a perfect ring on the glass surface, pale and precise. I did not wipe it away. Across the crowd, Leo cut a neat path like a man, accustomed to having space open in front of him. He had the kind of leather portfolio that looked new every day and a pen with a tiny crest at the clip. He shook my hand with the confidence of someone introduced to a family heirloom. "We should align on the Aegis story," he said, bright and friendly. He asked me to summarize how the core routed transactions through the risk lattice. He said he loved the idea of it, and then he said he wanted to make the technical parts land in a way people could feel. I told him I could take him through architecture, data flows, and the decision trees. He laughed softly. "Perfect," he said. "You can handle the boring part. I do the translation." He left before I could answer. I looked at the main display again. The logo completed another turn. The corners of the screen glinted with the reflection from a row of pendant lights that swung a fraction in the air conditioning. I do not pray, but sometimes a well-tuned system sounds like one. The message from people and ops sat in my inbox as a clean rectangle of polite language. I did not reply. I closed the mail client and opened a folder on my laptop instead. The folder had a name I liked to roll silently in my mouth. Atlas. The name was not grand in the way people thought. It reminded me that weight is a real thing. It reminded me that both systems and promises occupy space. In the Atlas folder were scans, invoices, change logs, and notes with dates so clear you could hear the seconds. There was the certificate for R Atlas Limited, the small company I had formed to hold the pilot. There were the cloud bills I paid in my own name during the prototype. There were the go-live logs from a rain night 2 years ago when I had pushed Aegis Core into production and watched the old rails drop their heat like a tired animal while the new shield took shape line by line. No one had ever asked to see those papers. That is not the same as those papers not existing. Close to 9, I got a call from legal asking whether I could come upstairs for a short briefing before the board met with Orbitis. The elevator doors opened with a sound that always made me think of a hand pulling taut a thin wire. When I walked out into the corridor of glass, there was a secretary with a headset who smiled without showing her teeth and asked if I needed water. I said I would be fine. She seemed relieved to have one less thing to hold. The boardroom had a long table and a wall that was a screen. The city pretended to be a painting in the windows. Callum Byan stood at the far end, sleeves smooth, face set in the kind of calm that money teaches. He nodded to me, then to the general counsel, then to the man from Orbitis who I knew only from a profile in a magazine. Leo was already seated near the front with his portfolio open and his phone face down. He glanced over at me and then at the clock. There were 4 minutes until the hour. The general counsel asked me to walk the group through the path of a single payment through Aegis. I opened my laptop and mirrored the architecture diagram to the side display rather than the main one. The diagram was clean. Ingress, validation, decision trees, enforcement, audit. There is nothing glamorous about a well-designed flow. It is the glamour of breathing. I pointed to the risk lattice. The lattice considers shape and history and context, I said. It does not predict in the mystical sense. It sorts and routes with rules that are visible and versioned. It is a library of disciplined guesses and a habit of checking them against the truth. That is why the audit trail matters. It does not matter when nothing fails. It matters when people disagree about why something succeeded. Leo raised a hand and smiled at the Orbitus representative. With the right story, he said, this will sound like our proprietary intelligence layer. We can call it an emergent routing system. I did not look at him. I enlarged the part of the diagram where the license check sits. A little heartbeat of text pulsed at the bottom of the window. It had always been there. License check R Atlas Limited. Timestamp 9:03 and 7 seconds. The letters were small enough to be invisible to anyone who wanted them to be small. The clock on the wall hit the hour. 2 phones vibrated almost in unison. The secretary stepped in and left a thin stack of papers at Callum's elbow. He put his hand on them without looking. The general counsel cleared his throat and asked whether the production system had any remaining dependencies from the pilot phase. He wanted the answer to be no. He wanted it with the hunger of someone who can see the shore and does not know the tide. The answer is that the dependency is legal rather than technical, I said. The core is stable. The ownership of the license for the core is still parked at R Atlas Limited pending transfer. The transfer was scheduled for a spring that never arrived. There was a note to remind everyone. The person who wrote that note did not live to remind us. The word pending hung in the room like a moth that had chosen the wrong lamp. The Orbitus representative looked at the screen and then at me. He asked me to show him the audit pings. I opened the system monitor that we run behind the scenes for comfort rather than necessity. A small line of quiet text repeated on the screen each time a decision tree executed for a new cluster of transactions. License check R Atlas Limited. It blinked again at 9:03 and 13 seconds. The time sat there like a date carved into wet concrete. Nea arrived late, breathless and bright, with 2 printed decks. She reached for my arm in a way that included me in a circle I had never asked to draw. She whispered that we should not scare our friends with paperwork today. I said nothing. The general counsel asked me whether the divergence between license holder and operator had been disclosed. He looked tired in the way people look when they have named the same cloud 100 different names. I took a pencil from my pocket and wrote on the whiteboard along the side of the room. I like pencils for meetings like this. A pencil makes a mark with the exact confidence you give it. I wrote 3 columns. Origin, use, remedy. Under origin, I wrote the name of the pilot company and the date. Under use, I wrote the number of days since go live. Under remedy, I wrote the simplest line I could write. License fee for past use calculated per day. License for future use calculated per volume. I did not write numbers. I did not write penalties. I did not write wounds into the page. Leo asked if we could rebrand the core as a new product before the announcement so that the narrative felt cleaner. The Orbitus man did not laugh, but he looked like he wanted to. Callum asked whether there was any scenario in which what I had just described would not be a material fact for a deal of this size. The general counsel did not answer. He put both hands on the table as if to keep the furniture from leaving the floor. At 9:03 and 26 seconds, the first phones on the board vibrated again. This time there were chimes. The board members looked down as if they had rehearsed it. The subject line on their screens was the same, perfect and plain, notice of unlicensed commercial use. The sender was a name the room had already learned to ignore. R Atlas Limited. The mail had been scheduled to leave exactly at that moment to exactly that set of inboxes. I did not tap send. I had done the work the night before and let time handle the rest. For a slow moment, only the city moved. A bus crossed the bridge below, red and deliberate. Someone in another conference room tapped a glass. Air traced the edge of the ceiling and made the pendant lights sway by a degree that only certain eyes care to measure. Then the voices returned. The general counsel asked to pause and confer. Callum asked whether the system would be interrupted if we respected the legal state of the license. I said the system would not break. I said a system can respect a law like a man respects a gate. It can stop to open it. It can also stop to repair it. Leo leaned toward me and spoke in a tone meant for a friend. He asked me to keep this within our team for a few days so that the larger story would not be derailed. He said this is too good a day to let a detail ruin it. I looked at the screen again. License check R Atlas Limited. The checkmark next to it was the color of wet leaves. The general counsel asked who represented R Atlas. I said a barrister named Maeve Quinn. I said Maeve had prepared a very short letter that weighed more than it looked. He asked whether I was prepared to negotiate. I said I was prepared to document. Then I said I was prepared to negotiate, but only with a document on the table and not a promise. Naya set one of her decks in front of me and tapped a page that said we rise together. Her nail was bright and perfect. I remembered the night I first placed Aegis on the rails. Rain had slid down the window in strands, and the bells from a church had sounded once and then stopped. In the log window, the lines had unrolled like threads pulled through cloth. When the new routing took its first breath, the old system made a sound like relief. Nothing in that room on that night had asked for applause. The Orbitus representative asked for a recess. He needed to call his people. He needed to ask whether a license that sat where I said it sat could be squared with a number that had already been printed in a term sheet. Callum nodded. He did not look at me. He looked at the ring of coffee I had left on the glass table and then at the clock. He asked whether I could be available for the rest of the morning. I said yes. I placed the pencil on the table, and it rolled a very short distance and stopped with the point toward the word remedy. I walked to the corridor and looked through the big window at the river. People went about their tasks on the far bank as if no one anywhere had ever signed a document. A courier adjusted a strap. A child kicked a leaf into a puddle and followed its little voyage to the curb. I remembered the 2 sticky notes in my file, old and soft, written by a lawyer who had told me once that the right kind of line drawn early can save 2 sides from being enemies later. Hold ownership during pilot. Remind transfer in April. The sticky notes had yellowed in the air of my apartment. The month had never arrived. When the bell stopped ringing for the person who wrote it, no one rang another bell for a piece of paper. My phone hummed in my pocket. A message from the secretary asked me to return to the room. I walked back past the glass that showed my thin reflection and the sweep of the display behind me. The small text at the bottom of the screen pulsed again as a batch of transactions made its way through the lattice. License check R Atlas Limited. 903 and 48 seconds. It was a heartbeat, and the system was alive, and we were about to decide what that heartbeat meant. When I entered, the air had gained an edge. Callum had loosened his cuffs. The general counsel had 2 printouts and a pen laid across them as if to prevent escape. Leo had a smile that tried for reassurance and landed just short. The Orbitus man spoke first. He said their side needed confirmation that the license state described in the letter was accurate. He said if it was accurate, then the transaction as currently structured could not proceed without an amendment and a cure for past use. He spoke like a man folding a map along a crease that had not been used in years. I slid the 3-page bundle I had brought to the middle of the table. I placed it so that the first page showed dates, the second showed an index of files, and the third showed the single paragraph labeled proposal. Pay for past use by the day. License for future use by the volume. I did not add adjectives. I did not add blame. I did not add history. No one spoke for a short while. On the far wall, the city changed its colors. The light on the river softened, and the buildings arranged their faces for the cameras of the day. Somewhere in the building, another group applauded for a different reason. The sound carried just enough to make our silence feel deliberate. The general counsel finally breathed out. He asked me in a formal voice whether I intended to interrupt operations if discussion did not lead to agreement today. I said no. I said systems are taught to fail gracefully. People can learn the same skill. He looked at the Orbitus man. The Orbitus man looked at Callum. Callum looked at the clock and then at me. He asked if the letter had been shared beyond the board. I said it had been sent to the board and the internal audit mailbox, both of which would eventually involve others. I said sunlight is not always a spectacle. Sometimes it is a disinfectant. I picked up my pencil again because my hand needed something to do. The wood was warm from my pocket. The tip still had the small sheen of a fresh point. In a corner of the whiteboard, I wrote a single time, 903. Then I drew a square around it and filled the square with a soft shade until the number looked like a window. No one asked me why I did that. It felt like the right shape to put around a moment that had already happened and could not be undone. The meeting moved on to the slow work of choosing words. I listened. I answered when asked. I did not sell and I did not beg. I trusted paper and clocks to do their part. The small line of text on the system monitor blinked without drama. License check R Atlas Limited. A reminder that a heartbeat is not a threat. It is only a fact. The corridor outside the boardroom smelled like new carpet and the faint metal scent of elevator cables. I stood by the window long enough to see a raft of birds tilt in the wind over the river and then made myself walk back to my desk. People in the open area glanced up from their screens the way swimmers lift their heads to breathe. I nodded to 2 engineers and a product manager who had worked the last incident with me. They looked as if they wanted to ask what had happened upstairs. I kept my face neutral. It is easier on everyone when the person with the key does not widen their eyes. I sat down, opened the Atlas folder, and created 3 subfolders with names that made sense to me. Origin, use, remedy. I do not need to be clever when a straight line will do. In Origin, I placed the certificate of incorporation for our Atlas Limited, the receipt for the registry fee, the bank letter that confirmed the account, and a short memo I wrote the day I created the company to remind myself why I was doing it. Hold the pilot so the blast radius is small. Make transfer only after the rails are cool. The words were plain and the idea was simple. It had stayed simple until a set of other things got complicated and people forgot to look where their feet were. In use, I placed the Go Live logs and the daily audit pings, 1 file per month, with checksums written into a text file the way I like to do it when I know I will need to prove that nothing has been touched. I placed the invoices for cloud resources during the transition and the split between what the company paid and what I covered while we were still in a gray area between prototype and production. I placed a screenshot from the first night that showed the license check message sitting quiet at the bottom of the screen like a small animal that knows it should not run. In Remedy, I placed a single document that described in 1 page what would be fair. I wrote it the way a civil engineer might write a sketch for a bridge. Pay for the distance already crossed. Pay for the traffic to come. Keep the lanes open and keep the signatures real. I do not enjoy writing legalese. I enjoy writing things that can carry weight. A chat bubble popped up from legal asking whether I could attend a negotiation block in the small glass room near the north stairwell. I typed yes and picked up my notebook and the pencil that had already learned the shape of my hand. As I walked through the halls, I passed 2 posters for a culture campaign that showed employees smiling with their eyes closed. The slogan spoke about trust. The soft focus made it look like a dream. Maeve arrived at the same time I did. She wore a dark suit and the plainest watch I have ever seen. She greeted me with a nod that felt like a steadying hand on the shoulder without the touch. She opened her case and placed 3 tabs on the table. The colors matched mine by accident or by the logic that happens when 2 people are trying to make sense of one thing. Naya entered with a neat stack of decks and a smile that was almost convincing. Leo followed with his portfolio and his easy voice. The general counsel joined last, carrying a legal pad that belonged to a decade when phones were heavier. A representative from Orbitus appeared on the screen, older than he had looked in the magazine, the kind of older that makes a person careful rather than slow. "Thank you for moving quickly," Maeve said. Her tone was even and soft in a way that made you lean in. She asked whether we could agree on a simple list of facts. The product called Aegis Core runs in production at Tessellate. The license for the core code is held by our Atlas Limited. The transfer of that license has not been executed. The system checks that license during operation and notes the holder. These are not accusations. These are facts. The Orbitus representative nodded once. The general counsel nodded as if he had decided to accept gravity. Naya spoke about intention and about how everyone had been acting in good faith. She said the company wanted to make this right. She asked whether we could resolve it without frightening the market. Her hands made a little circle in the air as if she were holding a small bird. I said nothing. I let silence point to the next action like a finger on a map. Leo said he would love for us to reach a solution that did not complicate the story the company had been preparing. He said there were ways to frame the core that would sound exciting without scaring people with the letter of a license. He said intelligence layer again. I watched the Orbitus representative blink and then half smile, not unkind, as if he were trying to remember a joke he used to tell. I slid the Origin tab into the middle and let the documents rest there without flourish. The certificate, the receipts, the sticky note photograph with the 2 lines in blue ink, hold ownership during pilot, remind transfer in April. The general counsel picked up the photograph between 2 fingers as if it were an insect that had somehow become a relic. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In a folder in my apartment," I said. It was written by the outside counsel who helped me set up the pilot. He passed away the following winter. The reminder to transfer fell between seasons and then fell between priorities. If that feels like blame, it is only the blame that belongs to a calendar that never asked for help. Maeve opened the Use tab and explained the audit pings. She did not raise her voice. She walked through the dates and the intervals and the first night when the system moved from testing into flow. She let the numbers tell their own story. I like watching her do that. Numbers tell better stories when the person reading them does not wink. The Orbitis representative asked whether any obligations had been breached toward previous partners or customers. I answered that the core had done exactly what it was meant to do and that customers had been protected better for it. The question on the table was not performance, but ownership. A child can be in good health and still not be where they are supposed to be in the eyes of the law. He nodded as if one piece of furniture had been moved into the right room. Maeve turned to the remedy tab. She slid the one page to the center. Past use calculated per day for the number of days since go live. Future use calculated per volume across the clusters agreed for this quarter and adjusted each quarter by a public index of traffic. A simple cap on liability to prevent theater. A clause that states clearly where authorship sits and how acknowledgement appears when materials describe the system in external communications. The clauses were more like beams than like ornaments. The general counsel read them, not fast and not slow. He put the page down and pressed a thumb into his temple. Naya tried to widen the field. She spoke about promotion and impact. She offered a title that sounded like something from a brochure. She offered restricted stock units that would vest as the partnership went public. She smiled and said none of this was in exchange for silence. She said it was a gesture of respect. I looked at the pencil in my hand. I said I was not hungry for a title, and that respect is a word that feels better when it follows a deed. She nodded and made a small note on a card the color of the sea. Leo asked whether we could at least rename the core while we moved through this process so that communications stayed aligned. Call it Sentinel or something like that, he said. Names can do a lot of work. I said names can also do a lot of damage if they are misapplied. The Orbitis man made the small smile again. He said the market likes names, but the market likes certainty more. He asked me whether the proposal on the table was a line in the sand. Maeve said the proposal was a bridge. I liked that she said it first. We broke for 15 minutes while the general counsel spoke quickly to Callum, and the Orbitis man stepped away to call. I stayed in the small room with Maeve and drank water that tasted like old ice. Maeve asked me how I was doing in a voice that belonged to neither the law nor the building. I said I was fine. I said my hands always shake a little after I have to say something that changes the direction of a day. She said her hands always shake a little before she has to say it. She blew across the surface of her water like a person cooling tea. When the call resumed, the Orbitis man said their side had no objection to the structure of the remedy and would prefer to see a number for the past use. He said they would need to amend the term sheet to reflect the license holder, and that it would be cleaner if the license came from me under the company you see in the header, rather than pass through Tessellate as if it had owned the core all along. He asked whether that was acceptable to me. I said it was acceptable and honest, and that systems like honest lines. The general counsel looked at Naya, who gave him an expression that tried for warmth. He turned to me and asked for the number. Maeve opened a second page that I had left blank and wrote 3 lines with simple arithmetic. She used the mechanism we had described and a daily rate that paired with a similar system in a public filing for a different industry. She chose a number that would not break a rib. She pushed the paper to the middle with 2 fingers. The general counsel stared, nodded, and then asked the one question that will always come. Would I accept equity in place of a portion of cash? Maeve said the company can always buy back its pride at a price of its choosing later. The cash pays for the road we already drove. I listened to my own breathing. I listened to the hum in the wall that means air is moving and a building is still doing its simple jobs. The small text on my laptop screen blinked again as another cluster of transactions made its way through the lattice of rules. License check : our Atlas Limited. The words had never raised their voice. When things are true, they do not need to. We agreed to a framework in that room, and we agreed to write it down in the larger room. Naya asked whether we could keep the matter within the board until the papers were signed. Maeve said the notice was already a document of record and that we could avoid theater by making this boring and correct. The Orbitis man said boring and correct are 2 of his favorite flavors. Leo said he would refresh the deck to reflect a new story that focused on resilience. I said resilience was a word that belonged to systems and to people who have had to carry something heavy without dropping it. The meeting ended on an exhale. The general counsel stood and rolled his shoulders as if he had been wearing a pack. Naya touched my arm again and told me she admired my composure and that she would check in on me later to see how I felt about a public note of appreciation. She said names are powerful when used gently. I said documentation is powerful when used at all. She laughed, and for a moment I liked her. Maeve and I walked out and found a quiet corner near a fire door. A strip of emergency light made the floor look like a runway to somewhere kinder. She leaned against the wall and looked at me with a small question. I told her about the 2 sticky notes again because I like saying the names of the dead when their work still matters. She asked whether I had other documents at home. I said yes. I said there is a box under my bed that holds a copy of the initial memo from the outside counsel about isolating risk during the pilot. She asked if I would mind bringing it in later. I said I would like to look at it tonight by myself first. Not to change it. To remember. Back at my desk, I opened a diagnostics window that most people never see because it offers no drama. Just rows of time stamps and small quiet truths. I set up a fresh export for the day so that the pings would be in one place for anyone who might need them. I wrote a little script that counted the intervals and made a small line of text at the bottom that said last checked at this second. I watched it tick and felt something unclench in my ribs. A message came from Callum inviting me to a closure session at the end of the day with the full board and the Orbitis team. The subject line said alignment. I accepted. I closed my eyes for one breath and saw the night of the first deployment again. Rain on the window, bells that rang once and then stopped, a system that moved from holding its breath to breathing. I opened my eyes and wrote in my notebook, time is the fairest accountant. Paper is the quietest witness. At lunch, I walked down to the cafe that looks toward the river. I bought a soup that tasted like someone had tried to make warmth into a flavor. I ate alone and watched people across the glass. A couple argued with their eyes. A tourist unfolded a map like a flower and turned it until the city made sense. A child knocked on the window and laughed at the way sound does not care about glass. I looked at my phone and saw a message from a number I did not know. The message said, I admire the way you hold a line. It signed a single initial. I put the phone back on the table and let the reflection of the window swallow it. When I returned to my desk, there was a small envelope not addressed to anyone. Inside was a card from facilities about a planned test of the fire system the following morning. The card used cheerful language to describe a loud event. I placed it next to the pencil and imagined a building practicing how to be brave. A test does not make a fire, it makes a habit. In the late afternoon, the small room filled again. People brought new versions of old papers. We agreed to the daily rate for past use. We agreed to the volume-based license for the road ahead. We agreed to a line about authorship that would live in the language the company used when it displayed the core to the world. We agreed to keep the system running while we wrote the last sentences. It felt like lowering a load onto a set of supports that had been waiting for years. When the day closed, I walked out into the cooler air and stood under the edge of the building where the wind makes a private sound. I put my hand in my pocket and felt the pencil and the little ridge where I press my fingers when I am thinking. Across the water, the lights came on in rooms where people would eat and talk and forget what they said. I went home by the long way to pass the church. The door was open and the inside smelled of wax. I did not go in. I stood by the gate and watched a caretaker move chairs with careful hands. He did not hurry. He put each chair where a person would sit and listen. I thought of the box under my bed and the memo inside that might explain why a simple protection had become a shield I did not expect to hold. I would take it out later and place it on my table and look at the date. I would not change it. I would let paper and memory do the work they were made to do. By mid-morning, the building had shifted into the tempo that follows a disturbance. People moved with intention but spoke softly. Screens showed slides rather than dashboards. You could feel the collective instinct to turn a fact into a story that could be carried without dropping shards on the carpet. Leo pinged me to join a rehearsal in the small theater on the second floor. The room had a short stage, a blank wall, and a projector that hummed like a small hive. A console sat near the front with a control pad built for a hand larger than mine. 3 members of the board had settled into the front row. Naya perched on the aisle with a marker poised above a notebook. The Orbitis representative appeared again on a tall screen, his face framed by a room with a view of a different river in a different city. We will run the sequence of the town hall, Leo said, crisp and upbeat. We will keep it clean and optimistic. We will respect the legal reality while giving everyone a way to feel proud of the road ahead. He looked at me and gave a little nod that meant please do not say something that twists the knife. I took a seat on the side steps where the wood was warm from the lights. Maeve did not join this part. This was not a legal conversation, even though the law sat on a chair like an extra guest. The lights dimmed. Leo began with a story about resilience. He spoke about how our team had built a platform that could root risk like a seasoned pilot steering through fog. He placed his palm open to show he had nothing up his sleeve. He talked about intelligence without promising magic. He said Aegis was an emergent system built by a community of craft and care. He was good at this. He made the hard parts sound like weather, present but not personal. The phrase intelligence layer returned, and this time he softened it with examples that matched ordinary experience. He said it in a way that might make a regulator nod rather than frown. He clicked to a slide with a diagram, not mine but not wrong. The arrows flowed. The boxes lined up. A small lock icon sat near the corner to suggest safety. He moved his pointer to the center to show where decisions were made. When his cursor drifted down the screen, it passed over a watermark in faint gray at the bottom right that the projector picked up better than a laptop would. Trial license status external. The words surfaced for a breath and then sank when he moved to the next slide. Naya lifted her head and looked at me. I kept my hands folded. This was not a gotcha. It was a reminder that screens tell the truth when they are not told which truth to tell. I asked Leo to return to the diagram for a few seconds to help with a question I knew the Orbitus man would pose. He did, gracious and curious. I stood at the console and enlarged the audit boundary. I spoke slowly. We run decision trees. We record versions. We log every passage through the lattice. The monitor shows a quiet line each time the system checks who holds the license. I left it at that. I did not repeat the name that everyone in the room could see if they wanted to look. The Orbitus man cleared his throat. He asked Leo to jump to the term sheet slide so the board could confirm the valuation assumptions with the new structure in mind. The slide came up like a curtain rising. Numbers sat with the poise of actors in the third week of a run. Aegis Core accounted for a share of value that could make or break a promise. 40% was a round number and did not pretend to be shy. You could feel air shift as the three board members leaned as one to read the fine print. I had known the ratio in broad strokes. Seeing it on 15 feet of wall made it feel like a mountain that had learned to live indoors. Leo did not flinch. He spoke about how the license alignment would not reduce the capabilities or the trajectory of the product. He spoke about clarity as a feature. He said the remedy would become a proof point that we do not just talk about governance, we live it. He has a gift for this, and sometimes I envy the way his sentences carry a room like music that knows where to land. The Orbitus man looked from the slide to me. He asked whether I agreed with the characterization. I said it was accurate if the document captured 3 facts with simple language. 1. Past use would be cured in a way that did not erase what happened or punish what did not happen. 2. The license for future use would come from the entity that holds the right to grant it. 3. Materials that describe the core would name the author the way a book names a writer, not as decoration, but as context. He said that was reasonable. The general counsel nodded as if someone had placed a stone on a scale that was trying to find balance. We paused the rehearsal for a minute so that the technical crew could fix the color on one of the projectors. Someone opened the side door, and a thin triangle of daylight fell across the floor like a blade growing from the wall. I walked into that stripe and listened to the murmur of the building. Far away, a lift moved and a trolley clicked. Nearer, the small fan inside the projector spun and found its level. There are days when I love these sounds more than any applause. We resumed. Leo delivered a section on culture. He invited Naya to say a few words about how the company learns from the unexpected. She spoke well. She spoke about systems that bend instead of breaking. She spoke about trust again, and this time I believed she meant the kind that leaves a mark on paper. She did not touch my arm. She looked at me once for half a second and gave me a nod that was not a performance. The rehearsal ended with a short question round so that the board could practice hearing the story they would have to repeat to their inner circles. One board member asked whether there was any risk of interruption to operations during the cure. I answered that the system would continue to operate without drama and that we would not ask it to hold its breath unless we were prepared to carry it the rest of the way. Another board member asked whether the market would read the notice as a scandal. Maeve was not there, so I answered in the only terms I trust. The market reads noise until you give it a number. We will give it a number. When the room cleared for lunch, Leo stayed behind with me to tweak the order of 2 slides. He stood at the console and scrolled while I sat on the step and watched the little storm of dust in the projector beam. He asked me if I hated him. He said it like a person who has learned to make a joke before someone else does. I told him I did not hate him. I told him I dislike the part of our culture that asks a translation to replace a fact. He said a fact without a story can feel cold. I said a story without a fact is wind. We were quiet for a moment that felt more like a truce than a fight. He asked me how long I had been keeping the Atlas folder. I said since the pilot. He asked if I planned it this way. I said I planned for a transfer that never happened. I said the rest was a consequence, not a trick. He said he admired the calm way I had handled the room. He said he did not know how to do that. I told him I count things. Counting is a way to move anxiety into a container. He laughed and asked what I was counting now. I said dust motes. He said he would be careful not to make more of them. In the early afternoon, we reconvened with a wider group that included Callum, the general counsel, Naya, Leo, 2 directors who rarely came in, and 3 people from Orbitus on the screen. The air felt like a suit that had been worn too many days in a row. We moved through the same beats as the rehearsal, but this time with the small risk that comes from saying the words when the words start to matter. The term sheet slide held its ground. The audit ping window glowed like a pulse under skin. I did not enlarge it. Everyone already knew what it said, even if they preferred the letters to stay small. Halfway through, a low bell tone sounded from several phones at once. The secretary opened the door and placed a slender folder at the end of the table for Callum. He did not read it. He placed his hand on it the way a person might steady a canoe. The Orbitus lead spoke. He said their governance committee had reviewed the notice and the proposed structure, and that they were willing to proceed on the condition that the license would be granted by the current holder and acknowledged in materials. He said they would need to update the valuation model to reflect the fact that the core was not an asset of Tessellate. His voice had the dry efficiency of someone adding a column to a spreadsheet. Callum nodded and then turned to me. He asked, in a way that sounded like civility learning a new muscle, whether I was open to a formal role in the new arrangement. He said advisor was one option. He said partner was another. He did not say employee. The word did not belong here any longer, and we both knew it. Maeve had joined us by then, and she answered that we were open to structures that protected authorship and encouraged stability. She spoke about steady bridges again. She used words that allowed everyone to keep a little pride in a jar on the shelf. I could feel the room ease by degrees you could not measure with instruments, but could measure with breath. We broke again, and I went to the corridor to drink water that had lost its chill. Leo followed and leaned against the wall with a soft thud. He told me he had learned something today that felt like a small pain but a useful one. He said he had built a career on making hard things sound easy, and that sometimes that is honest work, and sometimes it is theft. He said he was not sure which one today had been. I told him he did not steal the core. He tried to borrow the way the room listens. I told him to pay it back by telling the truth tonight. He nodded and rubbed his thumb across the ridge of his portfolio as if it could feel shame. Back inside, the general counsel suggested language for a joint communication to staff. He proposed a short note that explained the alignment without turning it into spectacle. He asked whether I would be comfortable with the note saying that our Atlas would license the core to Tessellate and that operations would continue without interruption. I said yes, and asked for one sentence that said the author would be acknowledged by name in future materials where appropriate. Naya looked at me and smiled with actual warmth this time. She said she would draft it and make it real. We returned to the theater to run the public sequence one last time with the revised slides. The projector took a breath and the first title appeared. Partnership restructured with clarity. The words were not poetry, but they were clean. Leo delivered his lines with less shine and more weight. The slide with the diagram kept its watermark in the corner, quiet as a fact. When he reached the part where he would have said intelligence layer, he said decision library instead. He did not look at me, but I felt the small current of a person changing a habit by choice. The Orbitus people watched and asked a final few questions the way a pilot taps gauges before a landing. When the rehearsal ended for good, the older representative on the screen spoke not to the room but to me. He said that the first time he saw a system save a company it was because someone wrote down what they had done when no one was watching. He said he recognized that posture in the way I held my pencil. I thanked him. It is strange to be seen by a stranger through a window made of pixels and time zones. Evening edged in through the high windows. The building exhaled the way it does when the day is done pretending. People went home to noise and warmth and the relief of leaving their names at the door. I stayed for a while in the empty theater and looked at the blank wall where our story had just played. Dust settled. The projector cooled. The hush felt like a room remembering itself. On my way out, I passed the security desk. The guard lifted a hand and then hesitated as if he had thought better of saying a thing. Then he said it anyway. He said he had worked the night we went live 2 years ago, and that he remembered me leaving at 3 with a face like a person who had carried a sleeping child across a bridge. He said the cameras catch everything and forget nothing. He tapped a finger on the counter and smiled. "Keep your pencil sharp," he said. At home, I took the box from under the bed and set it on the table. The tape made a small sound like an insect when I peeled it back. Inside were the papers that had lived with me through seasons. The memo from the outside counsel sat near the top, folded once. I did not open it yet. I placed it next to the photograph of the 2 blue ink lines with the month that never arrived. I poured water and sat and listened to the old pipes knock behind the wall as the building settled into night. I opened the memo. The title was dry in the way that protects a good idea from attention. Preliminary Risk Isolation for Pilot. The third paragraph contained a phrase that made my breath stop and then restart: bidirectional firebreak. It did not say the words that would become the twist, not yet, but it gave them shape. A fire break protects both sides. I placed the memo back in the box and rested my palm on the lid. The cardboard was warm from the lights. My phone lit with a message from Maeve. She asked if I had everything I needed for the morning. I wrote that I did. I wrote that I would bring a photograph of a page that might help people see not just a problem but a design. She sent back a single word. Good. She added a second word. Sleep. I lay down and watched the reflection of passing headlights on the ceiling. I thought of the ring of coffee on the glass table and the square I drew around the time on the whiteboard. I thought of the small text that had blinked all day with the patience of a heart. The building was quiet around me. The city softened. A breath later, the church bell sounded once and let the air go. I counted to 17 without meaning to. The number landed and did not roll away. Morning opened with a light rain that made the pavement shine like a fresh sheet of paper. I walked into the building with the feeling that the air had been reset. The security guard lifted his chin in greeting. His radio crackled once and then went quiet. I took the stairs instead of the elevator to calm my head. At each landing, I paused to hear the muffled hum of the floors waking up. Machines say good morning in their own way. Maeve texted that the 3-party session would be in the long room near the north stair. She added a small request. Bring the memo and the sticky note photo. Bring the pencil if it feels like a talisman. I smiled at the last line and replied that the pencil was already in my pocket. The long room had a view of the river and a table that looked heavy enough to outlast the building. Someone had placed water and small plates and a bowl of grapes that still wore a dusting you could wipe with a thumb. Nea arrived first with her pink blazer and a folder of drafts for a staff note. She looked at the view for a moment, as if the river might give her a better sentence. Leo came in with his portfolio and stood a little apart, as if he had learned that his voice needed to lose a little shine. The general counsel took a seat at the middle and lined up 2 pens. Callum stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and his reflection at ease against the city. The Orbitus lead would join by screen at the far end. Maeve entered last, simple suit, simple watch, hair pulled back in a way that made the room steadier. "Thank you for making the time," Maeve said. "We have a clear frame and we have to fill it with words that will carry weight without breaking the structure." The words were not a pose. She moved a single page into the center. It was the same page from yesterday with a few lines refined. Past use per day, future use per volume, acknowledgement where the company speaks about the system, a warranty on support so no one can paint a picture of a lone engineer holding the core together with fear. The screen woke and the Orbitus lead appeared. Behind him, another city opened its eyes in a different light. His smile was the exact width of courtesy. He greeted the room, and he greeted me by name. That small human thing made the table feel less like a field waiting for a first step. We started with facts. The general counsel confirmed the timeline and the state of the license. Maeve confirmed the remedy structure. I placed the memo and the sticky note photograph on the table without speech. The blue handwriting still looked freshly dry even after years. The phrase bidirectional firebreak in the memo sat there like a map symbol that knew how to face north. Callum studied the page for a long beat. He did not rush the moment. He turned to the screen, and said that the company would honor the split between operator and license holder and would accept a structure in which the license came from our atlas directly. Naya slid a draft of the staff note across for the general counsel to mark. The title said clarity with confidence. The line that mattered said that the company would proceed with a license agreement for the core and that operations would continue without interruption. She had added a sentence that named me and thanked the author of the core for discipline and care. The word author looked strange in a corporate note and exactly right. Leo asked to speak. He kept his hands on the table so we could all see they were empty. He said he would frame the public story with words that matched the facts and that he would not bend language to make the room comfortable. He said he had tried to be a good narrator and had sometimes been a thief by accident. He said he had listened yesterday and had felt something shift in his chest. It was earnest and awkward, and I felt the room give him partial credit for trying to step off a familiar stage. We moved to numbers. Maeve wrote them once on the board and then turned the marker toward the general counsel so that the board could own the ink. Past days multiplied by rate tied to a familiar benchmark for fairness. Future volume measured by clusters and adjusted quarterly with a public index. A cap to ensure proportionality. The Orbitus lead nodded after each line the way a person nods while checking parachute straps. He asked for the daily rate as a number, and Maeve spoke it like someone saying a latitude. We paused so the general counsel could take a call. The room softened for 5 minutes and then firmed again when he returned. He looked at Maeve, then at Callum, then at me. He said the company would accept the daily number and the volume structure. He said he would prefer a 3-year term with a renewal window that opened automatically unless either side moved to close it. Maeve agreed that automatic renewal would avoid yearly theater. Words can be places to rest when they are used well. Naya tried a different offer. She asked if I would consider a title and equity in addition to the license so that the internal culture could see my position in a light that would inspire. She said names help people to understand where to look. I told her I would consider an advisory post if the post protected my ability to be honest and if the license was independent of any title. She accepted that condition without flinch. She scribbled a note with a smile that reached her eyes. In that moment, I believed she wanted to repair something inside the company that had cracked before she arrived. Leo asked about branding. He asked if we should rename the core as part of the new chapter. The Orbitus lead coughed lightly and said markets do not like renaming things that are already working. He said it makes them feel like someone is hiding a stain. He suggested we keep the name and put our energy into making the documentation as good as the code. The word documentation made me feel the inside of my ribs go warm. The old counsel used to say that good documentation prevents bad politics. He was right more often than he was wrong. We drafted the license outline. We set obligations for support so that no one could claim the system would be a hostage. We set the line on authorship so that the name would live in the materials where it mattered. We set the boring parts that actually keep bridges from falling into rivers. The general counsel found simple phrases the way a mason finds stones that fit. The Orbitus lead adjusted a verb here and there to make it match the way his side would show the partnership in their own reports. We crossed out 3 adjectives without argument. It was the best kind of writing session because it made language smaller and stronger. Mid-session, there was a test of the fire system in the building. A bell sounded like a memory of a bell rather than a real emergency. Lights along the ceiling flickered once and then went steady. People stood automatically and then sat when the voice from the speaker told them to remain calm. I looked at the memo on the table and thought about the words that had kept our day from turning into smoke: bidirectional fire break. A safety for both sides. When the bell ended, we all looked a little more human. Someone laughed quietly. Callum rubbed his temples and then looked at me as if he had noticed for the first time that I was not afraid. He thanked me for the clarity of my notes. The thanks had the shape of a man who does not say thank you often. I accepted it without decoration. We took a short break. I walked to the window and watched a boat move under the bridge with a wake that made a proper V. Leo came to stand a step away, close enough to speak softly without the room hearing. He said he had been up late reading old emails and that he had found threads where I had suggested changes and had received 2-word replies that showed neither reading nor care. He said he was embarrassed. I told him embarrassment is only useful if it becomes a change in behavior. He nodded and said that is what he wanted. We went back to the table and put the near final draft on the screen. Maeve asked that we confirm the order of signatures. She suggested that our Atlas sign first to make the grant real, and then that tessellate sign as a licensee to avoid any shadow of implied ownership. The Orbitus lead agreed and said he would attach an amendment to their deal that referenced the license as a separate instrument. It was a small design choice with a large effect. Structure matters. It is the difference between a tent and a house. Naya read the staff note out loud. Her voice lost the public relations glaze and sounded like a person. She thanked the author of the core. She said the company was proud to operate Aegis under a license that reflected both the work and the future. She said the day was a chance to show that we trust systems that are transparent. She ended with a line that made me look up. Documentation is not a chore, it is a feature. She smiled at me, and I smiled back. It felt like turning a page together. The Orbitus lead excused himself for a final call with their governance committee. The screen went dark. The room exhaled. Callum leaned back and looked at the ceiling as if someone had removed a stone from his chest. The general counsel stacked his papers with care reserved for objects that have been through heat. Leo closed his portfolio and rested both palms on it as if to bless it into being more honest than it was yesterday. Maeve checked her watch and closed her pen. While we waited, I took out the pencil and wrote one more triplet on the corner of a pad. Ask for the simple remedy. Stay with the slow truth. Leave room for people to keep their pride. Maeve read the lines and whispered that she would steal them for another day. I told her to take them without guilt. Words are tools. They can live more than one life. The screen lit again. The Orbitus lead returned with a small smile that had stretch marks of relief. He said the committee had approved proceeding under the structure we had outlined. He said they would update their materials that afternoon. He said he appreciated the way we had kept drama out of a situation that could have fed on it. The room did not clap. It did not need to. A good decision is its own applause. We set signatures for late afternoon. I sent a message to the operations team to prepare for a license key update that would change nothing in the flow, but would make a small light glow in a different place in the monitor. I did not write poetry in the message. I wrote a list of steps and a time that would not disturb traffic. They responded with the thumbs up that is the language of quiet professionals. After lunch, the board gathered to see the final forms. Maeve walked them line by line through the parts that would govern real life when the room was empty. The general counsel added a paragraph about dispute resolution that was so calm it sounded like a lake. Callum signed. Naya witnessed with a signature that looked like an elegant wave. The Orbitus lead signed his amendment on camera and held it up to the lens with a small nod. I signed last for our Atlas using a pen that left a line without flourish. For a person who loves pencils, that felt like the right moment to use ink. The staff note went out. The building made its low animal sound when a mass mail drops. Screens lit across floors. You could hear attention shift the way you can hear wind go from one side of a field to the other. People looked up and then back down with expressions that said the day would go on. 2 engineers messaged me a simple line that said, "Proud of you." I typed back, "Proud of us," and meant it. In the late afternoon, we ran the key update. The monitor showed the same calm flow as always. The small line at the bottom changed its wording by 1 inch. License check: R Atlas Limited. Agreement active. The timestamp said 903 only in my head because I wanted it to. The real time was different. That felt right too. Not all moments wear the same clock. Leo stopped by my desk before he left for the day. He asked if he could bring me a coffee as a peace offering. I said he could bring a printout of the new deck with any mentions of intelligence layer crossed out. He laughed and said deal. He asked if I was coming to the after-work gathering. I said I might come by for 10 minutes and then leave before people remembered that I do not know how to small talk. He said he would stand between me and any questions that felt like a trap. When the building emptied, I stayed in the long room by the window with the quiet river. The light went soft, and the glass held that color the way a hand holds water. I opened my notebook and wrote the first lines of a short manual I wanted to give to the team next month. Documentation is a feature. Ownership is a responsibility. Transparency is a discipline. I added a 4th line that surprised me. Pride is lighter when it is shared. My phone buzzed with a message from the Orbitus lead. It was only a sentence. "Thank you for holding your line without making a show of it." I replied with a sentence of my own. "Thank you for choosing structure over theater." He sent a small dot that meant that was enough. I packed the box with the memo and the photograph and carried it home as a person carries a clock that still works. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like iron and wet stone. I walked over the bridge and stopped in the middle to look down at the surface. Ripples from an unseen wind moved in soft rings that met and passed through each other without argument. I thought of the ring of coffee on the glass table and of the square around the time on the whiteboard. I thought of the pencil in my pocket and of the line of ink on the agreement. I thought of how a day can split and then find itself again. At home, I placed the box on the shelf rather than under the bed. It had earned a higher place. I cooked a simple meal and ate it at the window. The city made its night sounds. A siren far away. A laugh on the street below that did not belong to anyone I would ever meet. I washed the dishes and left them to dry on a towel. I sharpened the pencil and set it next to my notebook. Before sleep, I opened the window to let in air that smelled like the river. I lay down and watched a shadow from a tree move across the ceiling. I counted it once, not to trap anxiety this time, to measure a quiet that had been bought with paper and patient words. Somewhere a bell sounded once and let the hour go. I closed my eyes with the image of a small line of text blinking contentedly in a corner of a screen. The system was alive, and so was I. Tomorrow we would carry the story forward, but tonight the day had done enough. The morning after signatures, the building felt lighter by a weight no one could name. People walked as if the carpet had a little spring in it. The screens showed fewer slogans and more dashboards again. I took the same stairs as always and paused at the landing where the emergency light makes a quiet stripe on the wall. I pressed 2 fingertips to the stripe as if it were a pulse. The stripe did not answer, which is how a good building says I am fine. A short note from Naya waited in my inbox. Thank you. The staff response is calmer than expected. We will run small listening circles next week. Would you be willing to join one to talk about documentation as a cultural habit? I wrote back yes and added a line about making notes that outlive job titles. She replied with a single check mark that made me like her efficiency. Callum asked to see me for 10 minutes at 9. I arrived at 8:58 and stood by the window until the clock turned. He gestured to the chair opposite his and let his hands rest palm down on the desk. He did not look like a man who enjoys confessions, which made what he said next feel honest. We were careless with the quiet parts of our craft, he said. We mistook silence for loyalty and speed for strength. Thank you for making us pay attention without making us bleed more than we had to. It was the kind of thank you that sounds like a person giving himself new instructions. He asked if I had thought about the advisory post Naya had mentioned. I said I would accept if the terms allowed me to write and to refuse theater. He nodded and slid a 1-page outline across the desk. The title was plain, Technical Architecture Advisor. The bullets were few and practical. Write the playbook we should have had. Chair a small guild of engineers with the authority to stop a release if the paper is wrong. Teach decision makers how to read a diagram without pretending it is a magic trick. It looked like work I could be proud of when no one was looking. I signed my name at the bottom. Ink, not pencil, because there are moments when a line should not be erased. When I left his office, I found Leo waiting in the corridor with 2 coffees and a paper folder. He handed me 1 cup and the folder without ceremony. Inside was the new deck, printed. The words intelligence layer were gone. The watermark at the bottom right of the diagram was not. He had circled it with a faint pencil line rather than cropping it out. I looked up and he lifted his cup. To accuracy, he said. His smile this time was smaller and better. At 10, the operations team gathered in our glass room to review how the license key rotation had gone. It had been uneventful in the way that makes professionals relax their shoulders. We looked at the monitor together and watched the small text at the bottom continue its patient cadence. License check: R Atlas Limited. Agreement active. Someone exhaled. Someone else made a small joke about giving the heartbeat a name. We let it pass. Not everything needs a nickname. Messages arrived from engineers in other offices who had been following the note. One wrote that they had built their own Atlas folders after a bad quarter last year and that they felt less foolish today. Another wrote that their mother would be proud of the line about documentation being a feature. I read each one twice and answered simply. Keep writing. Keep time. Keep your own pencil sharp. Around noon, I walked to the cafe that faces the river. The woman at the counter knows my order and my habit of counting change with a slight pause before I pocket the coins. She slid the cup toward me and said, "You look taller today." I laughed and said I was standing up straighter because the air weighed less. She nodded like a person who believes in weather. I carried the coffee to the balcony off the 2nd floor. A gull floated in the updraft and tilted its wings to draw a clean line through space. I took a sip and let the heat slow my thoughts. Then my phone buzzed with a number from a different country code. The Orbitus lead asked if I had 10 minutes. He spoke as if he were standing in a room with wooden floors. He said he had a proposal that was not a trap. He wanted to engage me as a partner on specific architecture reviews across their portfolio for the next 6 months while the transition settled. He said the fee would be the fee and the hours would be capped and the clauses would protect my independence. He said they would put my name where the work required it and nowhere else. I told him I would consider it and asked him to send the outline to Maeve. He said of course, and then hesitated. He asked if I would indulge him with a question that had nothing to do with paper. What did it feel like when you watched the core breathe for the first time? He said. I thought of rain and the single ring of a bell and the old rails cooling like an animal finding sleep. I told him it felt like watching a bridge accept its own weight without complaint. He said he had only had that feeling twice in his career. The call ended with the calm of two people who enjoy exact words. The rest of the day moved in small, useful steps. Naya drafted a public-facing paragraph for the website that would sit under a general explanation of our platform. It named Aegis, and it named me, and it named the license in a way that was neither showy nor shy. The general counsel approved it with a line that said precisely what he meant without trailing ribbons. The communications team scheduled it for the morning. The building did not shift when the scheduler blinked. Still, I felt the air change by a degree. In the afternoon, I met with a group of junior engineers who had asked if I could talk about how to write documents that survive. We sat in a room too small for the number of chairs and passed a pencil around like a talisman. I told them to write as if someone who does not like them will need to use their work in a storm. I told them to pretend they are explaining a map to a person who has just woken up in a strange city. I told them that dates make friends with memory and that small, accurate words take a beating better than big ones. A quiet woman in the back asked how to keep faith when other people get certificates for work you did. I said you pick one thing that is yours to honor and you do it well until the day the paper catches up. The calendar said it was time to join one of the listening circles Naya had organized. She began by asking when people had last noticed a small honesty. Hands went up with stories that did not need to be dramatic. Someone replaced a vague metric with a clearer one without asking permission. Someone documented a decision to skip a test and attached their name to the ticket like a signature of accountability. A person who had never enjoyed talking out loud spoke about catching a small bug in a policy and writing a note to the right person rather than making it a show in a public channel. We wrote the examples on the whiteboard until the board looked like a wall in a kindergarten where children had taped up careful drawings of trees and houses. The room felt good. On my way back to the desk, I passed the small theater and looked in through the glass. The projector was off, and the stage looked naked without a person on it. A single ladder leaned against the back wall, and a roll of tape lay on the front step like a coin that had fallen out of someone's pocket. I felt a tug to step inside to test the hush again. I did not. I let the room keep its silence. At 5, Maeve sent the outline from Orbitus. It was clean and respectful. She suggested we accept with 2 minor adjustments. A clause that prevented them from using my name in marketing aside from technical credits. A clause that let me decline a review without reason if I read a design that did not fit my sense of soundness. I agreed. She said she would handle the signatures in the morning. For a moment, I saw the boardroom again, and the ring of coffee and the pencil rolling to a stop at the word remedy. The word still felt right. When the office finally began to empty, I stayed. There is a grace in listening to a building cool. The fluorescent lights tick in microscopic ways that only reveal themselves to a patient ear. The elevator cables murmur like a throat swallowed by a large coat. The river outside rearranges its surface into gentle geometries. I took my notebook and wrote the first 3 sections of the playbook Callum had asked for. How to design a decision tree as if a child will inherit it. How to measure risk without lying to yourself about what is unknown. How to write the part of a log message that will be quoted in a meeting 2 years after you move to a different city. I closed the notebook and put it away. I took the box from the shelf where I had set it the night before and carried it to the kitchen table. I cleared a space as if I were setting a meal. The tape gave way with a small reluctance that felt like a habit learning a new one. I laid the papers out under the lamp in simple arrays. Certificates, invoices, logs, notes, the photograph of the sticky notes with the month that never arrived, and the memo. The memo waited folded in half as if preserving a crease is a kind of respect. I opened it and read it again slowly. The tone was modest. The point was sharp. Isolate the pilot to protect the company if the experiment fails. Leave authorship parked until acceptance so that the origin of design choices is clear and accountability has a place to sit. Use a bidirectional firebreak to prevent both technical and political spread. This phrase again, bidirectional firebreak. Today it sounded like a poem written by someone who did not like poems but loved what poems can do to air. I took a photograph of the page with my old phone. The camera made an honest image. No filters. The blue ink of the original signature looked like winter sky. I sent the photo to myself and to Maeve and saved it in the Atlas folder with a new name that included today's date. I placed the paper back on the table and aligned its edges with the edges of the table because there are small rituals that steady a person when larger things are moving. A text from Leo arrived. He said the after-work gathering had turned into a small celebration with less noise than usual. He said there was a cake and that someone had tried to draw a tiny shield on it with chocolate. He asked if I wanted a slice set aside. I wrote back thank you, no cake for me, but saved the plastic knife for my pencil case. He sent back 3 dots that meant he was laughing in a quiet way. I washed a plate and left it on the rack. I set water to boil for tea. I sat with the memo and the sticky note photograph and let the room come to a full stop. When the kettle clicked, I poured and stood at the window while the steam made its own weather against the glass. The street offered the sounds it always offers at that hour. A door, a laugh, a bicycle bell, a taxi slowing without needing to. I waited for the church bell and it gave me one measured tone before resting. On the table, next to the memo, I placed my pencil and the new pen I had used for the advisory outline. Wood and ink, erasable and permanent. In the margin of a small card, I wrote 4 lines to remind myself how to walk into tomorrow. Stay small in posture and large in duty. Let paper carry the heat. Trust clocks. Hold your temper and your line. I slipped the card into the Atlas folder and closed the laptop. Before sleep, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and the box near my knee. I thought about the past 3 days as if they were 3 movements of one piece. An opening in crisis that forced a room to learn a different scale. A middle that turned fear into structure. And now this shift of weight that left the table level where it had tilted. The twist hiding in the memo did not feel like a trick. It felt like a design revealing itself at the proper resolution. I set an alarm for the morning not because I needed it, but because I like the formality of telling time that we have a plan. The last thing I saw before turning out the light was the pencil under the lamp. The grain of the wood looked like a topographic map. I thought of bridges and rails and careful hands. I thought of a small line of text on a monitor that does not care about applause. I closed my eyes and let the day fold itself like a sheet until it made a neat stack on the chair by the window. In the soft dark, a thought arrived and stayed. Tomorrow I would take the memo to the room and let it speak plainly. Not to win. To complete the drawing. To show that a wall built years ago as a precaution had become a door through which we could all exit without smoke in our lungs. The center had moved, and for once it had moved to where the paper always said it should be. The morning smelled like wet iron and bakery air. I carried the memo in a slim envelope that felt heavier than paper. The city had the quiet of a weekday that is trying to remember itself. At the turnstile, the guard raised his hand and then looked at the envelope the way a fisherman looks at a sky that already knows the tide. I took the stairs again. I like the way stairs let a person arrive with a heart that is awake without being loud. Maeve met me outside the long room. She looked at the envelope and then at my face. She asked if I was ready. I said I was ready to let a page speak. She smiled with the corner of her mouth, the way a person smiles at a well-balanced tool. The room filled slowly. The general counsel arrived with a set of tabs. Naya carried copies of the staff note with small edits in blue. Leo entered with no portfolio for the first time. He had a notebook, and that was all. Callum came last and took his place with the patience of someone who has decided to spend the exact time required and no more. The screen woke to show the Orbitus lead at his desk with morning light in a different color. We began without ceremony. The general counsel recapped the agreement and the plan for a short public session later in the day. He spoke a sentence that made room for a new sentence. He asked whether there were any documents that would help sharpen the history for the record. Maeve gestured, and I placed the envelope on the table. I did not unfold it yet. I said there is a memo from the original outside counsel. It describes a design choice for the pilot in words that belong to his hand. It will not change our agreement. It may change the way we talk about how we got here. Callum nodded. The room leaned forward by an inch. I opened the envelope and slid the memo to the center. People always bend toward paper at the same speed no matter their title. I placed the photograph of the sticky notes beside it. 2 blue lines: hold ownership during pilot, remind transfer in April. The month that never arrived. Then I read the paragraph that matters. Risk isolation for pilot by use of a bidirectional fire break. The phrase sat on the table like a small metal object that has spent time in a river and come out clean. The general counsel asked to read the paragraph himself. He read silently and then out loud, slowly, as if each word needed its own breath. He asked me to describe what this had meant in practice during the first night of production. I told him about the rails that cooled and the shield that took weight 1 unit at a time. I told him about the little line of text that blinked to say who held the license and why that mattered when people forgot to keep track of a promise. I did not mention the bell that rang once in the dark. That belongs to me. Naya touched the edge of the memo with one finger and said this is the cleanest way she has seen politics avoided by design. She said she would like to include a reference in the internal note that credits the concept without turning a legal document into a storybook. Maeve nodded. She said a single line will do. She wrote it on her pad. The pilot used a 2-sided fire break so that a test could fail without burning the company, and so that after acceptance, the origin of design choices could be traced. She crossed out 2 adjectives and made the sentence better. The Orbitus lead asked a question in the tone of a person who sees a blueprint and wants to see the load paths. He asked whether the fire break as described could be taught to other teams as a governance pattern for complex pilots. He did not say the word policy. He said pattern. I like that. I told him yes, and that the pattern is not a trick. It is a door frame that refuses to pretend to be a wall. We all laughed a little because the image was too neat and also true. We moved to the business of memorializing. Maeve proposed that we add a short recital to the license about the pilot structure used, and that we place the memo in the company archive with access controls so that people who build systems can learn from it without turning it into another glossy poster. The general counsel agreed and suggested a note on the archive entry that says the intent of the structure is prevention, not leverage. Callum approved with a single small motion of his hand. Leo spoke in a voice that had lost its polish in a good way. He said he had always thought of architecture as a set of diagrams and clean lines. He said he now understood that the cleanest line in the last 2 years had been a sentence. He asked if he could use the phrase bidirectional fire break when he talked to the wider team as long as he credited the dead counsel and did not make it a slogan. I said he could. I do not mind a good phrase traveling if it keeps the sound of its original footfall. We took a short break so that the general counsel could insert the recital into the document. I stood by the window with Maeve. The river moved like a person in thought. She asked me whether the memo made me sad. I said it made me grateful that someone else had done careful work at the right time, and sad that he did not live to see the work save the day 2 years later. She said she would raise a glass to him tonight. She said she never met him, but she recognized his handwriting in my choices. When we resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The level of the floor felt even. The recital sat in the draft with dignity. We signed the minor amendment and the archive note. Naya updated the staff message to include a sentence about the pilot pattern without names. She added a second sentence that thanked the original counsel for wisdom that continues to protect the company. She asked whether I would feel comfortable with a footnote that named him in the internal edition. I said yes. She smiled like a person who likes it when a thank you finds its addressee. We shifted to the public session planning. Leo would host a short segment with 3 points. 1. The partnership was restructured with clarity and a direct license. 2. The system continued to run without interruption. 3. We are writing down what we learned so that we can be boring and correct again later. He put the words on a slide exactly that way. Boring and correct. No one asked him to change it. It felt like progress that we were letting a small truth stand without decoration. Before the session, I went to my desk to clean up the Atlas folder. I made a new README that explained the contents in the simplest words I could write. I added the memo photograph with a file name that any human could understand. I added a note that said please read with care and with the understanding that this is how we avoided harm, not how to accumulate leverage. Then I closed the folder and backed it up in 2 places that have never failed me. The public session took place in the small theater that had watched us try on stories the day before. The room filled with people from across the company and with some faces I did not know. The projector hummed its steady song. Leo spoke with a voice that had learned the weight of quiet. He kept to the 3 points. He did not chase applause. He did not hunt for a clever line. Naya read the note with the new sentence about the pilot pattern and the thank you to the council who designed it. People nodded in ways that looked like an office choosing to be a team. When it was my turn, I did not give a speech. I opened the architecture monitor on the side screen and let the small line at the bottom do what it does. License check: R Atlas Limited. Agreement active. The room breathed with me. I said that systems remember what we teach them to remember. I said people should do the same. Then I closed the window and let the projector fan down to silence. After the session, engineers and operations staff and a few product people drifted toward me in ones and twos. They had the kinds of questions I like. How do we name a decision tree so that we do not lie to ourselves? How do we pick a daily rate without inviting a fight? How do we keep paper honest when a calendar wants to eat it? I answered with tools rather than metaphors. Use dates in file names that your eyes can parse. Keep running logs that say what changed, who changed it, and why. Keep a separate page for promises and carry it like a passport. A young developer asked if she should start her own Atlas folder. I said yes, and then I added that a folder is a tool, not a weapon. She nodded and said she understood. Midday brought a short private meeting with the Orbitus lead and 2 members of his team who had flown in. We sat in a smaller room with a white table that reflected faces like water. They asked if I would consider reviewing 2 specific projects in their pipeline. One was a payments router for a new market. One was a fraud lattice that borrowed an idea from our decision library. They did not ask for my name on a slide. They asked for notes and diagrams and a list of questions that would make their teams better. I said yes, with the same independence clauses Maeve had put in the outline. They agreed and did not try to nibble at the edges. When they left, the younger of the 2 engineers lingered. He told me that 10 years ago his mother had run a small market stall and had nearly lost it to a system that refused to listen. He said that watching our monitor blink quietly today felt like watching a gate open for the correct reason. He thanked me and left before I could say anything that would ruin the clean line of his gratitude. In the late afternoon, Callum gathered a small group to close the circle on the day. He thanked the room again in his way, with few words and no bow. He asked me if there was anything else we needed to archive before the memory of urgency faded. I said yes. I said we should archive the first version of the staff note with the handwritten edits, because how a sentence becomes a sentence is part of the record. He looked at Naya, and she smiled and said done. The General Counsel added that we should also put a copy of the rehearsal deck in the archive for contrast with the deck we used, with a note that says language matters. Leo took that like a man who has learned that a bruise is not a verdict, only a record of contact. Evening came with a calm I could feel in my breath. I took the box home again, not because the office was unsafe, but because the act of carrying it had become a ritual that reminded me to keep my feet on the ground. I set it on the table and cooked something simple. I ate and washed and then sat with the memo and the photograph of the sticky notes. I thought about the dead counsel again. I imagined his desk and the light and the moment his hand wrote the phrase and did not know where it would land. I raised a glass of water to his name and said thank you in a room where no one needed to hear it but me. My phone buzzed with a message from Maeve. The Orbitus engagement was signed. She wrote that she would courier a copy in the morning. She wrote that she was proud in the way professionals are allowed to be proud. I sent a thank you and then wrote one more line. The memo felt like a door that remembered it was never a wall. She replied with a simple yes. I took my notebook and wrote a short chapter for the playbook. The title was Dry on Purpose. Pilot fire break as a pattern. I wrote 5 steps and a few examples and a small caution paragraph that said this is a safety device, not a lever to wrestle power. I drew a diagram with 2 rectangles and a gap that is not empty but full of intent. I wrote that a good gap can save a friendship. Then I closed the book. Outside, the city made the sounds of a place that survives. Tires on wet streets, a radio in a kitchen, a door that shuts without anger. I stood at the window until the church bell gave me a single note. I counted to the number I always count to now and then let the number vanish without holding it. I turned off the lamp and let the dark do its work of rest. In the last minutes before sleep, a shape took form that felt like tomorrow. I would meet the team in the morning with the first draft of the playbook. I would walk them through the diagram of the fire break and the way a log line becomes a proof. I would give them pencils and ask them to write the parts of their systems that have no clean sentences yet. We would pin pages to a wall and step back until the wall looked like a map of a country we were learning to love by building it. The wall had opened on both sides. No smoke, no sirens, no theater, just a page that had waited in a box for the hour when the city needed it. The first morning after the public session felt like a clear page. The air in the lobby had lost its rehearsed smile. People said good morning without an extra note, and their steps sounded like work instead of performance. I took the stairs as always. At the landing with the emergency light, I placed 2 fingers against the strip and listened to my own breath. The building answered with a hush that meant everything ordinary was holding. I reached my desk and opened the Atlas folder one more time. I made a copy and named it with the date in a way any human could read. I wrote a small readme at the top that said what had happened in the simplest words. We kept a pilot safe with a 2-sided fire break. We forgot to move a paper across a line. We remembered and we repaired. We wrote it down. Then I closed the folder and let it rest like a reliable tool returned to its hook. A calendar block waited at 9 for the first session of the playbook workshop. I carried a short stack of paper, a box of pencils, and a blue marker that had survived many meetings without drying. The room was a rectangle of clean walls and a window that faced the river as if the river were an audience. 5 engineers sat in a half circle. 2 from operations, 1 from security, and a product manager who had the look of a person who likes to label boxes in a cupboard. Naya slipped in quietly and took a chair at the side, a notebook already open to a blank page. I wrote 3 lines on the board before anyone spoke. Documentation is a feature. Ownership is a responsibility. Transparency is a discipline. I asked them to read the lines out loud, not because the room needed a chant, but because the mouth learns what the hand will need to write later. Then I drew 2 rectangles with a deliberate gap between them and labeled the shapes. Pilot, production. In the gap, I wrote 1 phrase, bidirectional fire break. The words made the room quieter the way a name can sometimes calm a child who has woken in the dark. We went slowly. I asked the team to bring an example from their current work where a small sentence might save an hour next quarter. The security engineer spoke about a key rotation that depended on a calendar entry in one person's head. We wrote a sentence that would move the calendar into a file and put the file where a system would notice it. The product manager described a decision about a threshold that had lived only in a chat message. We wrote a sentence with a date and a reason and put it next to the code. The youngest engineer asked how to know when a sentence is done. I said a sentence is done when a stranger can follow it on a rainy morning with a train to catch. Naya listened and wrote and asked for examples that could be borrowed by teams who live far from the core. When we broke, she stayed back and thanked me for giving people a way to hold responsibility in their hands without burning themselves. She looked at the box of pencils and laughed with her eyes. I told her the pencils helped because they do not pretend to be final. She said she would start carrying one. After the session, I walked to the small balcony outside the second-floor cafe with a cup of coffee and stood where the city collects its own weather. A boat moved slow under the bridge. A bus crossed above and left a reflection in the water like a sentence that forgot to end. Leo joined me and did not speak for a while. When he did, he said he had rewritten his part of the company handbook to replace 3 metaphors with 2 drawings and 1 list. He asked if I would look later. I said I would. We stood together in an easy silence. I am learning to like silence that does not come from fear. The rest of the morning belonged to work that will not make a headline. The operations team showed me the overnight logs, and we checked the audit trail and the health of the decision trees. The small text at the bottom of the monitor blinked with the same patience it had always had. License check: R Atlas Limited. Agreement active. I watched 2 cycles and then 3. The time was not 9:03, and that pleased me. Not every day should wear the same minute. When a system is alive, it does not tap the same beat to prove it. Around noon, Maeve sent a message to say the Orbitus engagement was in motion with the independence clauses intact. She added a smile I could hear even in a plain font. I answered with a thank you and a line about bringing her a copy of the first chapter of the playbook next week. She sent back 1 word. Deal. In the afternoon, I met with Callum and the General Counsel to finish a short archive task that we had promised each other. We gathered the rehearsal deck with its language that had tried to be smooth and placed it next to the final deck with its language that chose to be exact. We attached a note that said words matter, and we signed the note with our initials, a small line that will help a stranger long after we all change rooms. When we left, Callum asked if I had everything I needed for the advisory role. I said I needed time to write and a door I can shut. He smiled with a hint of surprise and said the company could do both. At 3, I took a call from the Orbitis team on one of their projects. 2 engineers and a program lead sat in a room with white tables and pale chairs. They shared a diagram for a new router meant to serve a market with rules that change like weather. I asked them to show me the failure paths first. They looked surprised and then relieved. We moved boxes and renamed 2 nodes and wrote 3 sentences under the drawing. We agreed on a daily ritual to export logs to a place a stranger can find. We agreed on an author line for the design page that listed the people who had carried the hardest pieces. When we ended, the program lead looked straight into the camera and said I forgot how good it feels when a drawing tells the truth. By late afternoon, the building had settled into the home stretch of a normal day. People passed my desk with greetings that sounded like they had slept. A small plant on the shelf tilted toward the light and made the shadow of a tiny forest on the wall. I opened my notebook and wrote another section of the playbook. The title was Dry Again, audit lines that read themselves aloud. I listed rules that have saved me more than once. Do not hide a date in a format that makes a person squint. Do not let a log speak like a poet. Do not let a silent failure pretend to be shy. Put the person and the reason in the place where time cannot erase them by accident. I drew a small mark next to the lines that came from the dead counsel. He keeps teaching me without asking for credit. A message arrived from the junior engineer who had asked me the question about certificates the day before. She wrote that she had started a folder for her current project and that she had placed a text file in it called Promises. She said it held 2 sentences and that simply seeing the file made her breathe easier. She asked if that was normal. I told her yes. It is normal to feel calm when a word has somewhere to live. Naya invited me to a small gathering in a conference room that looks toward the west. She called it a circle of thanks and made a point of keeping it short. People named small acts from the week. The facilities team had labeled a shelf with the right words. A designer had written a caption for a diagram that did not sell, but explained. A manager had changed a deadline to avoid turning a plan into a scramble. When it was my turn, I thanked the dead counsel by name. We stood quiet for a breath that felt like a bell in reverse. I saw 2 hands move to hearts by instinct. On the way back to my desk, I passed the boardroom that had hosted our rough morning 2 days ago. The glass reflected the river in gray and blue stripes. Someone had cleaned the table, and the ring of my coffee was gone. I pressed my palm to the glass for a second and felt the chill of a surface that does not keep a history of every touch. That is what paper is for. I thought of the square I had drawn around 903 and smiled. The number did not belong to the wall. It belonged to the line we put on a page. Evening brought a quiet that told the truth. I stayed behind to clean the edges of the day from my desk. I sharpened the pencil and set it next to the new pen. I gathered the printouts and placed the ones worth keeping in a folder labeled with the month. I left 2 sticky notes on my monitor, one for a number I wanted to check tomorrow, and one that said tell the team about bridges and weather. I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the soft light from the window. On the walk home, the city made the gentle sounds I now know by heart. A bicycle chain whispering over teeth. A door clicking in a hallway 1 floor up. A voice that rose and fell with an accent that I associate with a corner shop that smells of tea and cardboard. When I reached the bridge, I stopped in the middle and leaned on the stone. The river carried shadows that moved like thought. Clouds parted enough to give the water a line of silver. I breathed in and the air returned the taste of rain held in metal. At home, I set the box on the table again, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to say good night to the work that had accompanied me. I took out the memo and read the paragraph that had saved us once more. It did not glow. It did not shout. It sat with the dignity of a sentence that knows what it is for. I placed it back in the box and slid the lid into place with a sound that satisfied. I set the box on the shelf above eye level where I keep the things that deserve respect. I cooked a simple meal and ate with the window open a hand's width. A gull called and someone laughed on the street. I washed and dried the plate and put it away. I made tea and carried the cup to the window and leaned my hip against the sill the way my grandmother used to when she settled to talk to herself. I thought about the advisory outline and the workshop and the Orbitis review and the playbook chapter, and the way the small text at the bottom of the monitor had looked today. I thought about how pride feels lighter when it is shared, and how I had written that line without planning to. I thought about the weight I used to carry alone and how the floor of the building now felt level under everyone's feet. My phone vibrated with a message from the security guard at the front desk. He sent a photograph taken from the lobby camera the night we went live 2 years ago. It showed me at 3 in the morning with my coat collar up and my head lowered, and my hands tucked into my sleeves like a person protecting a candle. He wrote one sentence: "Cameras forget, people remember." I sent back thank you and felt something like mercy. Later, before sleep, I opened my notebook one last time. I drew a line across the page and wrote on one side what we had ended and on the other what we had begun. We had ended a habit of letting a paper wait longer than a person. We had ended a style of speech that tried too hard to sell. We had ended the idea that the core is an ornament to be displayed. We had begun a discipline of naming facts. We had begun a pattern that keeps pilots honest. We had begun a story where the author is listed on the first page without apology. I closed the book and placed the pencil on top so that the grain of the wood pointed toward the window like a compass. I lay down and let the room darken itself around me. The day folded its edges and found its place on the stack. In that soft drift before sleep, the monitor of my mind showed the small line of text that has become a kind of prayer. License check : R Atlas Limited. Agreement active. It blinked once as if to say I am still here and you have done enough for now. Somewhere in the city, a single bell sounded and then rested. I counted to a number that belongs only to me and let the count go. In the morning, there will be more rooms and more paper and more pencils. There will be meetings where I will choose quiet when quiet is honest and voice when voice is necessary. There will be engineers who write better sentences than I do, and I will be glad. There will be a river outside the window and a building that hums without drama. There will be a folder called Atlas that is not a secret and not a weapon but a practice. There will be a core that roots risk like a bridge bears weight, and a company that has decided to keep its balance by honoring the drawings. Aftermath is only another word for beginning when the work is steady. I turned to the side and let sleep find me like a system settling to stable after a long migration. In the distance of my thoughts, a door that had once been mistaken for a wall stayed open on both sides, letting air move the way it should.